They called it the orphan's grave. Harlan Tanner even wagered $5 that the Whitmore children would freeze to death before Christmas. 6 weeks later, Harlan himself was kneeling at the entrance of that very cave, begging to be let inside. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to 47 degrees below zero. Death waited in every gust of wind. Inside, 18-year-old Elspeth Whitmore was milking her goats as if it were just another ordinary morning. But that moment was still weeks away. And to understand how a teenage girl and her younger brother came to hold the key to survival for an entire valley, we must go back to the autumn of 1887, when the diphtheria came to Stone Creek. The disease arrived with the October rains. It moved through the valley like a silent thief, taking the young and the old with equal cruelty. By the time the first frost touched the ground, 14 people had been buried in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. Among them were Ewan and Moira Whitmore. Ewan had been a miner in his youth, working the deep coal seams of Scotland before bringing his young bride to America. He was a quiet man who trusted the earth more than he trusted people. He had taught his daughter everything he knew about the ground beneath their feet, about the way temperature behaved underground, about the secrets that the land held for those patient enough to listen. Moira had been the warmth of the household, the one who sang while she worked and who could make a feast from almost nothing. She had given Elspeth her copper-colored hair and her unwavering determination, and she had given young Callum his gentle nature and his way with animals. They died within 2 weeks of each other, Ewan first, then Moira, as if she simply could not bear to remain in a world without him. Elspeth held her mother's hand as she passed, and she made a promise that she would take care of her brother, no matter what came. The funeral was held on a gray Tuesday morning. The wind carried the minister's words away almost as soon as he spoke them, scattering prayers across the valley like dead leaves. Elspeth stood beside the twin graves with her arm around Callum's thin shoulders, feeling his body shake with silent sobs. Bramble, their father's old sheep dog, pressed against her legs, his graying muzzle lifted toward the sky as if searching for a scent that was no longer there. The mourners filed past, offering condolences that felt as empty as the wind. And then, before the last handful of dirt had been thrown, Uncle Silas appeared. Silas Whitmore was Ewan's older brother, though the two men could not have been more different. Where Ewan had been thoughtful and patient, Silas was sharp and acquisitive. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, having accumulated land the way some men accumulated debts. He wore his success like armor, and he looked at the world through eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He had not come to the funeral to grieve. That evening, Elspeth discovered him in her father's study, going through the papers in the old oak desk. The lamplight threw harsh shadows across his face as he rifled through documents, his fingers moving with the efficiency of long practice. "What are you doing?" Silas looked up, showing no embarrassment at being caught. "Looking after your interest, girl. Someone has to. Those are my father's private papers. Your father is dead." The words were blunt, delivered without softening. "And you are a child with a child to care for. The sooner you accept the reality of your situation, the better for everyone." Elspeth said nothing. She had learned from her father that silence could be a shield, that sometimes the best response to cruelty was simply to wait. 3 days later, Silas called a family meeting. The parlor of the main house was crowded with Whitmores. Silas sat in the largest chair, positioned before the cold fireplace, like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. His wife Prudence occupied the settee, her narrow face arranged in an expression of sorrowful concern that did not reach her eyes. Her knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, a constant rhythm of judgment. Their son Thaddeus stood by the window, arms crossed, refusing to look at Elspeth. Various cousins and in-laws filled the remaining seats, a chorus of witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Elspeth sat on a hardback chair near the door, Callum pressed close beside her. The boy had barely spoken since their parents' deaths, and his face had taken on a pale, haunted quality that made him look younger than his 13 years. Bramble had been forbidden from entering the house, and Elspeth could hear him whining softly on the porch outside. "We are gathered here," Silas began, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority, "to discuss the future of these children." Elspeth noticed that he did not use their names. They were already becoming abstractions to him, problems to be solved rather than people to be considered. Their situation is grave. Silas paused, allowing the word to land with its full weight. They are orphans now, without means of support. The farm their father left is small and poorly situated. The northern parcel is nothing but rocks and scrub, completely unsuitable for cultivation. In winter, it is one of the coldest and most exposed locations in the entire valley. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled relatives. Furthermore, Silas continued, it would be unconscionable to allow two children to attempt to survive alone on such unforgiving land. Elspeth is barely 18. The boy is only 13. They have no experience, no resources, and no one to guide them. The poor dears, Prudence interjected, her voice dripping with performative sympathy. She looked up from her knitting just long enough to shake her head sadly. They'll perish just like their parents if something isn't done. It would be a mercy, really, to take them in before tragedy strikes again. Exactly, Silas nodded gravely, which is why I have a proposal. He produced a document from inside his coat, unfolding it with deliberate ceremony. I am prepared to take responsibility for these children. They will live here, in this house, where they can be properly supervised and cared for. Elspeth can help Prudence with the household duties. The boy can work in the stables. They will have food, shelter, and the guidance of a proper family. He paused, letting the generosity of his offer sink in. In return, I ask only that Elspeth sign over the deed to the northern parcel. It adjoins my own land, and while it is largely worthless, I can perhaps find some use for it. This small sacrifice seems a reasonable exchange for the security and protection I am offering. The assembled relatives nodded their approval. It was a fair deal, their expressions said. More than fair, really. Silas was being remarkably generous. Elspeth felt Callum's hand tighten on her arm. She could feel the fear radiating from him, the desperate hope that she would make this all go away, that she would find some way to keep them together and safe. She stood. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. She smoothed the fabric of her worn wool skirt and lifted her chin to meet her uncle's gaze. I have something to read, she said. Her voice was quiet, but something in its tone made the murmuring stop. Silas's eyes narrowed. This is not the time for... My father left a will. Elspeth reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded paper, its edges worn from handling. He also left a letter. For me. She unfolded the document and began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. I, Ewan James Whitmore, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath the northern parcel of my land, comprising 47 acres, to my daughter Elspeth Moira Whitmore, to be hers absolutely and without condition upon the occasion of my death. This land is not to be sold, traded, or transferred to any other party without her explicit written consent. She looked up. Silas's face had gone rigid. There is more, she continued. A letter, written in my father's hand. She unfolded the second paper, and her voice softened as she read the words her father had left for her. My dear Elspeth, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you must face the world without me. I am sorry for that, more sorry than words can express. But I want you to know that I have not left you without resources. The northern land holds a secret. There is a cave there, hidden in the broken hills, that I discovered years ago and have been preparing ever since. The cave goes deep into the earth, and the earth, my daughter, is the greatest protector of all. Remember what I taught you. The ground that will embrace us in death can also shelter us in life. Go to the cave, trust what you know, and never let anyone tell you that wisdom is foolishness simply because they lack the eyes to see it. Silence filled the room. Silas was the first to recover. A cave, he laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. Your father's great legacy is a hole in the ground? The land is mine, Elspeth said, legally and absolutely. You have no claim to it and no authority over me or my brother. You are a child playing at being an adult. Silas rose from his chair, his voice hardening. Do you think you can survive a Montana winter in a cave? Do you think your goats and your dog will keep you warm when the temperature drops to 40 below? You will fail. You will freeze. And when you come crawling back, begging for the charity you are too proud to accept now, I may not be so generous. Elspeth walked toward the door. Callum scrambled to follow her. You are making a mistake, Silas called after her. A fatal mistake. She paused at the threshold and turned back. Her eyes swept across the assembled relatives, all those faces that had known her since childhood, and were now looking at her with pity or contempt, or both. My father survived winters in Scottish mines that would kill every person in this room, she said. He taught me what he knew, and you will see whether it was wisdom or foolishness. Then she was gone, leaving behind a stunned silence and the lingering echo of her refusal. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment when everyone around you said you were wrong, but something deep inside told you to trust yourself anyway? Have you ever stood alone against the judgment of people who were supposed to care about you? Hold on to that feeling as we continue, because Elspeth's journey is only beginning, and the challenges ahead will test everything she believes. They left before dawn 3 days later. Silas had made good on his threat, giving them 72 hours to vacate the family property. Elspeth used every minute of that time to prepare. She packed what she could carry on her own back and what the two goats, Hope and Mercy, could bear in small, carefully balanced panniers. A sack of flour, a side of salt pork, her mother's cast iron pot, her father's spade, its wooden handle worn smooth by his hands, a sharp knife, a tattered quilt that still smelled faintly of her mother's lavender sachets. And the papers. Always the papers. The deed, the letter, the crude map her father had drawn showing the location of the cave. Callum carried a smaller pack, filled with dried beans and a change of clothes. He had not argued when Elspeth told him they were leaving. He had simply nodded, his face pale and resigned, and begun gathering his things. The boy who had once chattered endlessly about the animals he loved and the adventures he dreamed of having had become a ghost of himself, hollowed out by grief. Bramble knew something important was happening. The old dog had been restless all night, pacing between the children's beds and the door, his ears pricked forward at every sound. When Elspeth finally opened the door into the pre-dawn darkness, he pressed against her legs and looked up at her with eyes that seemed to understand everything. "We're going home, boy," she whispered. "Our real home, the one Father prepared for us." The goats were less enthusiastic. Hope and Mercy had spent their lives in a comfortable barn, and they were not pleased to be roused before sunrise and fitted with unfamiliar packs. But they were gentle creatures, well trained by Callum's patient hand, and they eventually settled into a plodding rhythm behind the small procession. They walked away from the cluster of buildings that made up Stone Creek without looking back. To look back was to give the past power over the future, and their future, however uncertain, was all they had left. The first day was not so bad. The trail wound through familiar territory, past the Henderson farm and the old mill in the creek where Elspeth had caught tadpoles as a child. The autumn sun was warm on their faces, and the aspens along the water had turned to gold, trembling in the light breeze like coins catching the light. But as they climbed higher into the foothills, the character of the land began to change. The soft, loamy soil of the valley gave way to shale and hard-packed clay, punctuated by stubborn clumps of sagebrush and skeletal juniper trees. The trail, such as it was, became steeper and more treacherous. Loose rocks turned under their feet. The wind picked up, carrying a knife edge of cold that hinted at the winter to come. This was the northern parcel, the worthless land, the 47 acres that Silas had dismissed as nothing but rocks and scrub. By the end of the second day, Callum was struggling. His pack seemed to have doubled in weight, and his thin legs trembled with every step. He had not complained, not once, but Elspeth could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his shoulders hunched forward as if the sky itself were pressing down on him. "We should rest," she said, though every instinct told her to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the people who wished them ill. "I'm fine." Callum's voice was barely a whisper. "I can keep going. We're stopping." She found a sheltered spot beneath a limestone overhang, a shallow cave that offered protection from the wind. They ate a cold supper of salt pork and hardtack, too tired to build a fire. The goats huddled together nearby, their breath steaming in the rapidly cooling air. Bramble lay across the entrance of the shelter, his body a warm barrier against the darkness beyond. That night, Elspeth dreamed of her father. He was standing at the mouth of a cave, his miner's lamp casting a pool of golden light around his feet. He was smiling, that rare, quiet smile that he reserved for moments of genuine happiness. "You're close now, lass," he said. "Just a little farther." She woke before dawn, her heart aching with the memory. The dream had felt so real that for a moment she expected to see him standing there, waiting to guide them the rest of the way. But there was only the gray light of early morning, and the cold, and the long road still ahead. The third day was the hardest. The trail had disappeared entirely, replaced by a jumble of limestone outcrops and hidden ravines that seemed designed to break ankles and shatter hope. Elspeth consulted her father's map constantly, trying to match the crude drawings to the landscape around them. A distinctive rock formation here, a dry creek bed there, a stand of twisted junipers that looked like old men frozen in mid-argument. Callum fell twice, the second time badly enough to tear a gash in his palm. Elspeth bandaged it with a strip of cloth from her mother's quilt, trying not to let him see how worried she was. Infection out here, with no doctor and no medicine, could be a death sentence. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "I'm trying. I really am." "I know you are." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "And I need you to keep trying just a little longer. Father said the cave is close. We're almost there." What if it's not real? The question burst out of him, carrying all the fear and doubt he had been holding inside. What if Father was wrong? What if there's nothing out here but rocks, and we came all this way for nothing? Elspeth pulled him into her arms, holding him tight against her chest. She could feel his heart racing, could feel the tremors running through his thin body. "Do you remember what Father always said about the earth?" Callum shook his head against her shoulder. "He said that the earth holds secrets for those patient enough to listen. He said that the ground that will embrace us in death can also shelter us in life." She pulled back, looking into his tear-streaked face. "Father spent years exploring this land. He wouldn't have sent us here if there was nothing to find. We just have to trust him a little longer." They walked on. The sun was setting on the third day when they found the dry creek bed that her father's map indicated. It wound between towering walls of limestone, narrow enough in places that Elspeth could touch both sides with her outstretched arms. The walls were striated with bands of color, red and orange and cream, the record of countless ages written in stone. And then, as the last light was fading from the sky, the creek bed opened into a hidden box canyon. Elspeth stopped so suddenly that Callum walked into her back. It was exactly as her father had described. A natural amphitheater carved by millennia of water and wind, its walls rising high on three sides to form a protective embrace. A thin trickle of water emerged from a fissure in the rock face, pooling in a shallow basin before disappearing back into the gravel. The floor of the canyon was covered with hardy grasses and deep-rooted herbs, enough forage to keep the goats fed for weeks. And there, in the north-facing wall, was the cave. The entrance was partially obscured by a tumble of ancient rockfall, but Elspeth could see the dark opening beyond, could feel the cool air flowing out from the depths of the earth. It was not a grand cavern, not the sort of thing that would appear on maps or draw tourists from far away. It was a modest opening, perhaps 6 feet wide and 4 feet high, the kind of thing that most people would walk past without a second glance. But Elspeth saw it for what it was, a sanctuary, a chance. "Callum," her voice came out as a whisper. "We're home." The entrance was nearly blocked. Centuries of debris had washed down from the canyon walls, filling the mouth of the cave with rocks and dirt and the decayed remains of long-dead vegetation. Standing before it in the gray light of dawn, Elspeth felt the first cold fingers of doubt wrap around her heart. Her father had said the cave went deep, but he had also been here years ago, before the accumulation of all this rubble. What if the passage beyond had collapsed entirely? What if there was nothing left but a shallow depression in the rock, useless for the shelter she needed to build? She could not afford to think that way. "We dig," she said, as much to herself as to Callum. "We start now, and we dig until we break through." The first day was a lesson in humility. Elspeth attacked the rubble with her father's spade, putting all her strength into every stroke, and by midday she had cleared perhaps 2 feet of debris. Her hands were already raw, the palms blistered where the wooden handle rubbed against skin unused to such labor. Her shoulders screamed with every movement, and the pile of rubble seemed to mock her, scarcely diminished despite hours of work. Callum did what he could, carrying away the smaller rocks in a makeshift basket woven from willow branches. He worked without complaint, but Elspeth could see that he lacked the strength for the heavier labor. The illness that had swept through their family had left him weakened, and months of grief had done nothing to restore him. By evening, they had cleared perhaps 4 feet into the entrance. The cool air from within flowed more freely now, carrying with it the scent of deep earth and undisturbed time. It was a promise, Elspeth told herself. A promise that the cave was real, that there was space beyond the rubble, that her father had not sent them here to die. The second day was worse than the first. Elspeth woke before dawn, her body stiff and aching in ways she had never experienced. Every muscle protested as she forced herself to rise, to eat a meager breakfast of cold porridge, to take up the spade once more. The blisters on her hands had broken during the night, leaving raw patches that wept clear fluid. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept working, trying not to notice the blood that seeped through the fabric. Callum watched her with worried eyes. "Ellie, you're hurting yourself. The cold is coming." She did not stop digging. "Every day we delay is a day we don't have. But if you can't use your hands, then I'll dig with my elbows, or my teeth." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. "We don't have a choice, Callum. Do you understand that? There is no going back. There is no one coming to help us. We either break through this wall and make a shelter, or we freeze to death in the open. Those are our options." The harshness of her words hung in the air between them. She saw the hurt flash across his face, followed by something harder, something more resolved. "Then teach me how to dig properly," he said. "Show me what to do." They worked side by side after that, falling into a rhythm that made the impossible seem merely improbable. Elspeth would loosen the packed earth and pry out the larger stones, and Callum would drag them away from the entrance. They spoke little, saving their breath for the labor. The only sounds were the scrape of the spade, the clatter of falling rocks, and the occasional bleat from the goats grazing nearby. Bramble seemed to understand that something important was happening. He took up his guardian position outside the growing excavation, spending his days lying in the sun just outside the opening, his ears pricked for any sign of danger. At night, he would sleep across the threshold of whatever shelter they had managed to create, his body a warm barrier between the family he had adopted and the cold darkness beyond. "Good boy," Elspeth would whisper as she passed him on her way to bed each night. "Good, brave boy." Bramble would thump his tail against the stone floor and close his eyes, content in the knowledge that his people were safe. Days bled into weeks. The weather held, granting them a mercy that Elspeth knew could not last. The mornings were cold now, frost glittering on the grass, but the afternoons were still warm enough to work without the constant fear of frostbite. She pushed herself harder each day, knowing that every hour of mild weather was a gift that might be snatched away without warning. The cave revealed itself slowly. First came the entrance chamber, a space roughly 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough that Elspeth could stand upright. The walls were smooth limestone, worn by water that had flowed through here thousands of years ago. The floor was covered in fine, dry sediment, soft as flour. It was shelter. Real shelter. Elspeth stood in the center of the cleared space and felt tears streaming down her face, cutting channels through the dust that coated her skin. But she could not rest. The chamber was barely large enough for themselves, let alone the goats, and it was the goats that would keep them alive through the winter. Their milk, their warmth, their companionship in the long, dark months ahead. She kept digging. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever worked so hard for something that your body begged you to stop, but your heart wouldn't let you? Have you ever pushed through pain and exhaustion because the alternative was simply unacceptable?" That's where Elspeth was, day after day, fighting against the earth itself for a chance at survival. And she had no idea that she was about to discover something that would change everything. It happened on a sweltering afternoon in late October. Elspeth was working at the back wall of the entrance chamber, chipping away at what seemed to be solid rock. Her arms ached. Her hands, now hardened by weeks of labor, had gone numb hours ago. She was operating on pure stubbornness, her mind empty of everything except the next stroke, the next chip of stone, the next inch of progress. And then her spade struck something that sounded different. It was not the solid clunk of rock against rock. It was a hollow, resonant thump, like knocking on a door. Her heart quickened. She tapped the spot again, listening intently. The same hollow sound echoed back. "Callum!" Her voice cracked. "Callum, come here!" He scrambled over the rubble pile, his face flushed from the exertion of hauling rocks. "What is it? What's wrong? Listen." She tapped the wall again. His eyes went wide. "That sounds like there's something behind it. Help me clear this section." They worked together with renewed energy, pulling away the loose stones and dirt that covered the back wall. As they dug, Elspeth began to see that this section of rock was different from the surrounding limestone. It was darker, more porous, and it crumbled under her fingers in a way that solid rock would not. "It's rotten," she breathed. "The rock here is rotten. Father must have known. That's why he marked this spot on his map." She grabbed a heavy juniper log from their pile of gathered wood and positioned it against the weakened section. "Stand back," she told Callum, "and be ready to run if the ceiling starts to come down." She swung the log like a battering ram. The impact sent shockwaves up her arms, but the rock held. She swung again, and on the fourth blow, a large section of the wall crumbled inward with a grinding roar. Dust billowed out, thick and choking. Elspeth stumbled backward, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. For a terrible moment, she thought the entire cave was collapsing around them. But the rumbling stopped. The dust began to settle, and through the jagged openings she had created, Elspeth saw darkness. Not the shallow darkness of a small chamber, but a deep, profound darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. "Stay here," she told Callum. "I'm going to look." She lit a candle with trembling hands and held it before her as she stepped through the breach. The flame flickered in a draft of cool air that flowed from somewhere far ahead, and then she saw it. The second chamber was enormous. The ceiling arched high above her head, lost in shadow beyond the reach of her candlelight. The floor was mostly level, covered in the same fine sediment as the entrance chamber. And when Elspeth held up her candle and turned in a slow circle, she could see that the space extended back at least 30 feet, maybe more. This was not a shelter. This was a sanctuary. She sank to her knees in the soft dust, the candle trembling in her hand. All the weeks of labor, all the pain and exhaustion and doubt, it had all been leading to this moment. Her father had known. He had known this was here, and he had left her the map to find it. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you, Father." Over the next several weeks, Elspeth transformed the raw cave into a working system. The second chamber became the main living space for the goats. She lined the floor with thick layers of dried grass, creating an insulating bed that would protect them from the cold stone beneath. She built low walls of stacked rock to divide the space into sections, one for the goats themselves, one for the fodder she was gathering, and one small corner for the day when Hope and Mercy would deliver their kids. The entrance chamber became her workspace. She constructed a milking stand from 3 large flat stones, 2 for the base and 1 for the platform. It was immovable, rustic, and perfectly functional. She dug a shallow drainage channel into the rock floor, ensuring that any spilled liquids would flow toward the entrance rather than pooling where the animals slept. From the clay she excavated, she mixed a crude plaster with water and dried grasses, using it to fill the gaps between her stacked stone walls. The result was surprisingly solid, a barrier against drafts that would have cut through any wooden structure like knives through butter. She worked from first light until she could no longer see, driving herself with a relentless energy that left no room for doubt or fear. Callum worked beside her when he could, learning to identify the best grasses for fodder and the most stable stones for building. He was still thin, still pale, but something in him was beginning to change. The hollow look was fading from his eyes, replaced by something that might have been hope. And through it all, Bramble watched. The old dog had claimed his post at the chamber entrance, spending his days lying in the sun just outside the opening, his ears pricked for any sign of danger. At night, he slept across the threshold of the inner chamber, his warm bulk a comfort in the darkness. "Good boy," Elspeth would whisper as she passed him on her way to bed each night. "Good, brave boy." Bramble would thump his tail against the stone floor and close his eyes, content in the knowledge that his people were safe. But safety, Elspeth was learning, was never guaranteed in the Montana wilderness. And the first test of her sanctuary was approaching faster than she knew. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when that word involves scandal or strangeness. By the time the first November snow dusted the valley, everyone in Stone Creek knew about the Whitmore orphans and their cave. The story had spread from farmhouse to farmhouse, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said Elspeth had gone mad with grief and was raising her brother like a wild animal in the wilderness. Others claimed she was practicing some kind of dark magic, communing with spirits in the depths of the earth. A few, mostly the women who had known Moira, worried quietly that the children were suffering and that someone should do something. But no one actually did anything. Not until Harlan Tanner went hunting. Harlan was 22 years old, the son of the blacksmith, and he had the kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged in his life. He was tall and strong and good-looking, and he knew it. The girls in town smiled at him, and the men bought him drinks, and he had come to believe that his opinions were worth more than most people's facts. He had also been friends with Thaddeus Whitmore since childhood. So when Thad mentioned at the saloon one evening that his troublesome cousin was apparently living in a hole in the ground, Harlan saw an opportunity for amusement. He found the canyon on a gray afternoon in mid-November. The trail was faint but followable, and Harlan had good eyes and better instincts when it came to tracking. He left his horse tied to a juniper at the canyon's mouth and made his way on foot toward the thin wisp of smoke he could see rising from somewhere ahead. What he found stopped him in his tracks. The cave entrance had been transformed. Neat stacks of firewood lined one wall. A carefully constructed windbreak protected the opening from the worst of the weather. Through the gap in the rocks, he could see the warm glow of a small fire and hear the soft bleating of goats. And there, emerging from the darkness with a bucket in each hand, was Elspeth Whitmore. She looked nothing like the frightened girl he remembered from the funeral. Her copper hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her face had been weathered by weeks of outdoor labor. Her hands, he noticed, were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who worked for a living. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They were clear and absolutely unafraid. "Harlan Tanner." Her voice was flat, unwelcoming. "You're a long way from the saloon." "Just passing through." He tried to sound casual, but something about her gaze made him feel like a schoolboy caught misbehaving. "Doing some hunting up in the hills." "There's no game in this canyon. You'll want to try the ridge to the east." "I can see that." He glanced past her into the cave, trying to get a better look at the setup inside. "So this is where you're living now? In a hole?" Elspeth set down her buckets and crossed her arms. "Is there something you wanted, Harlan? Or did you just come to gawk?" "Easy, easy." He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just curious, that's all. The whole town's talking about you. Some folks are taking bets on how long you'll last." "Are they?" $5 says you'll freeze before Christmas. That's the going rate." He grinned, waiting for her to react. She didn't. She just looked at him with that unwavering gaze until his grin began to falter. "You should get back to your hunting," she said finally. "The weather's turning. It's a long walk back to town." He left without another word, but the encounter had unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. There was something about that girl, something that didn't fit with the picture of a desperate orphan that he'd had in his head. She hadn't seemed desperate at all. She had seemed certain. The story he told at the saloon that night was rather different. "You should see it," he announced to the assembled drinkers. "She's living in a hole, literally a hole in the ground. Got her little brother in there with her, and some goats, and that mangy old dog of her father's. The place smells like a barn and looks like something an animal would dig." Laughter rippled through the room. "That girl is digging her own grave," someone said, and the laughter grew louder. $5 she's dead by Christmas," Harlan repeated. "Anyone want to take that bet?" Several hands went up. Dr. Cornelius Marsh arrived at the cave 3 days later. The doctor was a precise man of 45 years, educated in Philadelphia and proud of it. He had come to Stone Creek a decade ago, driven by a combination of idealism and debt, and he had stayed because the town needed him, and because he had discovered that he rather enjoyed being the smartest person in any given room. He came to the cave, he told himself, out of medical concern. 2 children living in a damp underground space without proper ventilation would certainly develop respiratory problems. It was his duty as a physician to assess the situation and make recommendations. What he found confounded him. The cave was not damp. It was dry, surprisingly so, with air that moved in a gentle but constant flow from somewhere deep within the rock. The children were not huddled in squalor. They were clean, reasonably well fed, and engaged in purposeful activity. The goats looked healthy. The dog looked healthy. Even the small fire burning near the entrance was well managed, its smoke drawn upward through a natural fissure in the rock rather than filling the space with dangerous fumes. It was, he had to admit, rather impressive, but he was not about to say so. "This is highly irregular," he announced, looking around the entrance chamber with what he hoped was an expression of professional concern. "The air quality in a subterranean space is notoriously poor. Without proper ventilation, you risk lung disease, brain fever, all manner of ailments." Elspeth was mucking out the goat area with a wooden rake. She did not stop working. "Do you feel short of breath, doctor?" "That's not the point. The air in this cave has been circulating for thousands of years. It comes in through the entrance and exits through fissures higher up. It's cleaner than the air in most of the houses in Stone Creek." Marsh's face reddened. "I am a trained physician, young lady. I think I know more about respiratory health than a girl who lives in a hole." She finally looked at him, and he saw that same certainty that had unnerved Harlan Tanner. "Perhaps, but I also know that my father survived 30 years in Scottish coal mines, breathing air that would choke most men, and he lived to be 53. He understood how air moves underground. He taught me." "Your father was a miner, not a scientist." "No, he was both." She returned to her work. "Is there anything else, doctor?" "I have a great deal to do before the snow comes." Marsh left with his dignity intact, but his certainty shaken. He reported to Silas that evening that the children were in no immediate danger, but that their living situation was unorthodox and inadvisable. Silas nodded and said nothing, but Prudence's lips thinned with disappointment. They had been hoping for worse news. But the most insidious damage was done not by doctors or ministers, but by Prudence Whitmore herself. Silas's wife had a gift for gossip. She could take a simple fact and spin it into a scandal, could plant a seed of doubt and watch it grow into a forest of suspicion, and she wielded this gift against her niece with calculated precision. "The poor dears," she would say to anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Living in a hole like animals. It's not natural. It's not Christian. I told Silas we should intervene, but he says we must respect their wishes." She would sigh dramatically. "I only hope they don't suffer too much when the cold comes." The words spread through Stone Creek like poison, coloring every conversation about the Whitmore orphans. People who had never met Elspeth began to speak of her as if she were mad, as if the grief of losing her parents had unhinged her mind. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the canyon. Shopkeepers watched her warily on the rare occasions she came to town for supplies. "That girl is building her own tomb," Prudence declared at a quilting circle one afternoon. "Mark my words, come spring, we'll be digging them out of that cave, frozen solid, and Silas will have to bury them next to their parents." Such a tragedy, such a waste. The other women nodded and clucked their tongues, already composing the eulogies in their heads. None of them imagined that come spring, it would be Prudence herself begging for the milk that only Elspeth's goats could provide. Reverend Josiah Blackwood came the following week. The minister was a tall, severe man with a voice like a church bell and opinions to match. He had shepherded the spiritual welfare of Stone Creek for 25 years, and he took his responsibilities seriously. Too seriously, some said. His sermons had a way of leaving the congregation feeling guilty about sins they hadn't even known they'd committed. He found Elspeth outside the cave, scraping a goatskin that she intended to use as a door covering. Callum was nearby, feeding the goats from a basket of dried grass. Bramble lifted his head and growled softly at the stranger's approach. "Miss Whitmore." The Reverend stopped a few feet away, looking at the cave entrance with an expression of barely concealed distaste. "I've come to discuss your situation." Elspeth straightened, wiping her hands on her worn apron. "Good afternoon, Reverend." "This cannot continue," he said, getting straight to the point. "Living in a cave is not appropriate for God-fearing Christians. It is primitive. It is pagan. it sends entirely the wrong message to the community. What message would that be? That you have abandoned civilization, that you have rejected the proper way of life that our Lord intended for his children. His voice rose, taking on the cadence of a sermon. Human beings are meant to build, Miss Whitmore. We are meant to raise houses and churches and schools, to lift ourselves above the animals. We are not meant to burrow into the earth like moles. Elspeth paused in her work. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. Reverend, do you know what the temperature is inside the tomb of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem? He blinked, thrown off balance by the question. What? 54 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, regardless of the weather outside. The stone keeps it cool in summer and warm in winter. She resumed scraping. Our Lord spent 3 days in a cave carved into rock. It seems he didn't consider such places unworthy. The Reverend's face went through several colors before settling on a mottled red. That is entirely different. Is it? She looked up at him. I'm not asking you to approve of how I live, Reverend. I'm not asking anyone's approval. I'm simply trying to keep my brother alive through the winter. If you have practical advice on how to do that, I'm happy to hear it. But if you've only come to tell me that God disapproves of caves, I think we'll have to agree to disagree. He left without asking for anything. But the following Sunday, his sermon was about the sin of pride and the dangers of setting oneself above the wisdom of the community. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Several people glanced at Silas, who sat in his usual pew with an expression of righteous satisfaction. The betting pool on the orphan's survival grew larger. The first person to offer genuine help came from an unexpected direction. Ingrid Lindqvist was 75 years old, a widow who had outlived 2 husbands and all 5 of her children. She lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, surviving on a garden, a few chickens, and the stubbornness that had carried her across an ocean from Sweden 60 years ago. She arrived at the cave on a bitter November morning, having walked 3 miles through a light snowfall, with nothing but a walking stick and a canvas sack slung over her shoulder. She found Elspeth hauling water from the spring, her breath pluming in the cold air. "You are the Whitmore girl," Ingrid said. It was not a question. Elspeth set down her buckets, studying the old woman with wary eyes. "I am. And you are?" "Ingrid Lindqvist. I knew your mother. She was kind to me when I first came to this valley, when my English was poor and most people looked at me like I was something the cat dragged in." She peered past Elspeth toward the cave entrance. "I heard you are living in the ground. I wanted to see for myself." "Everyone wants to see," Elspeth said, an edge of bitterness creeping into her voice, "so they can go back to town and laugh." "I am not laughing." Ingrid stepped closer, her pale blue eyes sharp despite her years. "In my country, we have a word, Jordkellera. It means earth cellar. My grandmother had one, back in the old country. She kept her food there, and sometimes in the worst winters, her animals too. The earth stays the same temperature, summer and winter. It is warmer than any barn when the snow is deep." Elspeth felt something loosen in her chest. "Your grandmother knew about this." "Everyone knew in the old days, before people decided they were too civilized to listen to the earth." Ingrid opened her canvas sack and began removing items. Seeds in small paper packets, a bundle of dried herbs, a jar of rendered fat. "I brought you some things. The seeds are for spring, if you're still here. The herbs are for medicine. The fat is for your hands. I can see they are cracked and bleeding." For a moment, Elspeth could not speak. After weeks of judgment and mockery, this simple kindness from a stranger was almost too much to bear. "Thank you," she managed finally. Thank you." "Do not thank me yet." Ingrid's voice was stern, but her eyes were warm. "The winter is coming, and it will be hard. Harder than you can imagine if you have not lived through one before. But you have good instincts, girl. Your father taught you well. Keep working, keep preparing, and when the snow comes, stay in your cave and trust the earth to protect you." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. There is a man who lives in the hills to the north. Old, keeps to himself. They say he was a soldier in the war, and something broke inside him. But he knows this land better than anyone alive. If you see him watching you, do not be afraid. He watches everything. It is how he survives." Elspeth saw the watcher 3 days later. She was returning from a foraging expedition, her arms full of the winter-fat shrubs that the goats seemed to love, when she noticed a figure on the ridge above the canyon. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn buckskin, with a long rifle cradled in his arms. He stood motionless, silhouetted against the gray sky, watching her. Her first instinct was fear. She was alone out here, miles from any help. A man with a rifle could be anyone, want anything. But Bramble, who had accompanied her on the expedition, showed no alarm. The old dog's tail wagged slowly, and his ears were pricked forward with what looked almost like recognition. Elspeth raised one hand in a cautious wave. The figure did not wave back, but neither did he make any threatening move. He simply stood there for a long moment, watching, and then turned and melted back into the rocks as silently as he had appeared. She saw him several more times over the following weeks, always at a distance, always watching. She began to think of him as her silent guardian, a presence that was somehow reassuring rather than threatening. Whoever he was, he clearly had no intention of harming her. He seemed merely to be observing, keeping track. Then one morning she found a gift at the spring. It was a pickaxe head, old but still serviceable, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. There was no note, no explanation, just the tool, left where she would be sure to find it. Elspeth knew immediately who had left it, and she knew what it meant. That afternoon, she packed a small cloth with rounds of the tangy cheese she had learned to make from the goat's surplus milk. She left Callum to tend the animals and followed the faint trail that led north from the canyon into the wild country beyond. She found his camp in a narrow defile, perhaps 2 miles from her own sanctuary. It was a spare affair, a canvas tent weathered to the color of stone, a well-tended fire pit, an assortment of traps and tools arranged with military precision. A horse was picketed nearby, cropping at the thin grass. The man himself was sitting on a flat rock, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. He looked up as she approached, and she saw his face for the first time. He was perhaps 63 years old, maybe older, with a face that had been weathered by decades of sun and wind until it resembled the leather of his clothing. His eyes were pale and washed out, the color of winter sky, and they held a depth of weariness that spoke of things seen and endured that most people could not imagine. "I know who you are," he said before she could speak. "You and Whitmore's girl. I saw you working on that cave. Watched you for weeks now." "I know." She held out the cloth bundle. "I brought this, for the pickaxe." He took the cheese, unwrapped a corner, and cut off a piece with his skinning knife. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's good," he said finally. "Tastes clean, like the mountain." "I'm Elspeth. My brother's name is Callum. Ezra Boone." He did not offer his hand, and she did not expect him to. "Your father was a good man, quiet, kept to himself. I respected that. Did you know him well?" "Well enough." He took another bite of cheese. "He came up here sometimes exploring. Said he was looking for something. I suppose he found it." They sat in silence for a while, two solitary people in the vast emptiness of the wilderness. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of understanding, of two souls who had both known loss and had learned to carry it. "Winter's coming early this year," Ezra said finally. "I can feel it in my bones. The squirrels are bearing twice as many nuts as usual. The elk are moving down from the high country already. When it hits, it's going to be bad." "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm thinking about moving my camp closer to your canyon, just in case." He looked at her with those pale eyes. "You've done good work, girl, better than most would manage. But you're going to need more than determination to get through what's coming. You're going to need luck, and friends. I have Callum and Bramble. You have me too now, whether you want me or not." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "I've been alone a long time. Might be nice to have neighbors for a change, even if they are living in a hole in the ground." Over the following weeks, Ezra became a regular presence at the canyon. He never stayed long, never intruded on their space, but he would appear every few days with some useful contribution. A haunch of venison from a successful hunt, a bundle of juniper branches for reinforcing the cave entrance, his pickaxe on loan for as long as they needed it, and he brought knowledge. 20 years of surviving alone in these mountains had taught him things that no book could convey. He showed Elspeth how to read the weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of the animals. He taught her which lichens were edible in an emergency and how to set snares for rabbits. He helped her position a heavy juniper beam across the cave entrance, braced to withstand the freeze-thaw cycle that could bring down loose rock. In return, she gave him fresh milk and cheese, luxuries he had not tasted in years. And she gave him something else, something he had not known he needed. She gave him purpose. "Why do you live out here alone?" Callum asked him one afternoon. The boy had lost some of his fear of the grizzled old man. They had discovered a shared interest in animals, and Callum had spent hours listening to Ezra's stories about the wildlife of the mountains. Ezra was quiet for a long moment. "I had a son once," he said finally, "about your age when I left for the war. I told him I'd be back soon, that everything would be all right." He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing something far away. It wasn't all right. Nothing was ever all right again. Did he die?" "Yes, while I was gone. Fever took him." Ezra's voice was flat, empty of emotion. "By the time I got home, he'd been in the ground for 6 months. My wife couldn't bear to look at me anymore. She said I reminded her too much of what we'd lost. She left, and I came out here, where I couldn't remind anyone of anything." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and put his small hand on Ezra's weathered arm. "I'm glad you're here now," he said, "even if it was bad before." Ezra looked at the boy's hand on his arm. Something shifted in those pale eyes, something that might have been the first thaw after a very long winter. "So am I, son," he said softly. "So am I." The last visitor came in early December. Thaddeus Whitmore rode into the canyon on a gray morning, his horse picking its way carefully through the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. He found Elspeth and Callum outside the cave, building a windbreak from stacked stones and juniper branches. "Well," he said, reining in his horse, "you're still alive." Elspeth straightened, wiping her hands on her worn apron. "Did your father send you to check on us?" "He did." Thad dismounted, his movements stiff with cold. "He wanted to know if you were ready to give up yet." "And what will you tell him?" Thad did not answer immediately. He walked past her to the cave entrance and looked inside, his eyes moving over the neat stone partitions, the healthy goats, the organized stacks of fodder and firewood. He reached out and touched the smooth wall, feeling the cool, constant temperature of the rock. When he turned back, his expression had changed. "I'll tell him you're not starving," he said, which is what he expected by now. "But this," he gestured at the cave behind him, "this is something else. I don't know what this is." "It's survival," Elspeth said. "The same thing your father does with his big house and his barns full of cattle, just different." "Different?" Thad laughed, though there was no mockery in it. "That's one word for it." He hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package. "My mother doesn't know I took this. Some coffee and sugar. Thought you might want something other than goat's milk and whatever you've been eating out here." Elspeth stared at him. Of all the Whitmores, Thad had been the hardest to read. He had never openly opposed her, but he had never helped her either. He had simply been present, silent and watchful, following his father's lead. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why are you helping us now?" He looked away, uncomfortable. "Because my father is wrong. He won't admit it, and I can't say it to his face, but I know what I see." He met her eyes again. "And what I see is that you're going to make it. Against all odds, against everything everyone said, you're going to survive out here. And when you do, I don't want to be one of the people who tried to stop you." He mounted his horse and turned to go. Then he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "The old folks are saying this winter is going to be bad. Really bad. My father doesn't believe them, but I've seen the signs myself. The woolly worms are darker than I've ever seen them. The wasps built their nests low this year." He held her gaze. "Be careful, Elspeth. Be ready for anything." Then he was gone, leaving behind only hoof prints in the snow and a small package of luxuries that felt, in that moment, like hope. What Elspeth did not know was that Thad's visit had not been entirely his own idea. That evening in the parlor of the Whitmore ranch house, Thad stood before his father and delivered his report. Silas listened in silence, his face betraying nothing, while Prudence sat in her chair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking with agitated rhythm. "The cave is real," Thad said, "and it works. They have shelter, food, water. The goats are healthy. They're going to survive the winter. Silas said nothing for a long moment. Then he rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "No," he said quietly. "They won't. Father, you don't understand winter in these mountains, boy. None of us do, not really. But I've seen what happens when a real storm comes. I've seen cattle freeze standing up. I've seen men lost between the house and the barn, found dead 20 feet from safety." He turned back to face his son. "That cave of theirs might keep out the cold, but it won't keep out hunger. It won't keep out sickness. And when they come crawling back, broken and desperate, I will be here to take what should have been mine from the beginning." "You're going to let them die?" Thad's voice cracked with disbelief. "I'm going to let nature take its course." Silas's smile was thin and cold. "God helps those who help themselves, and those children refused my help." Prudence looked up from her knitting, her thin lips pressed together in satisfaction. "It's for the best, really. The girl is too proud by half. A winter in that cave will teach her humility, if nothing else. And if it kills her, then God's will be done." Silas returned to his chair and picked up his newspaper, signaling that the conversation was over. "We wait. That's all. We wait, and we watch, and when the time comes, we'll be ready." Thad left the room without another word, his stomach churning with a shame he could not name. 2 days later, Ezra appeared at Elspeth's Canyon with a warning. "Your uncle's been asking questions in town," he said, his pale eyes sharp with concern. "Asking about you, about the cave, about how much food you have stored. He's not planning to help you, girl. He's waiting for you to fail." Elspeth felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I know. Do you?" Ezra leaned closer. "Because I've seen men like Silas before. They don't just wait for you to fail. They make sure you fail. Watch your supplies. Watch your animals. And don't trust anyone who comes from that direction without a good reason." She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her like a second winter. "I'll be careful," she said. "I promise. Before we continue, I want you to think about something. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought might help you was actually hoping you would fail? Have you ever felt that cold realization that you were truly on your own? That the people who should have been your safety net were actually waiting to catch you when you fell? Not to help you up, but to prove they were right all along?" That's where Elspeth was now, alone in the wilderness, with winter coming and her own family betting against her survival. But she had something they didn't count on. She had knowledge they didn't understand, and she had friends they didn't know about. The storm came on December 23rd. It started innocuously enough, a gentle snowfall in the early afternoon that dusted the canyon with white and made the world look like something from a Christmas card. Elspeth noticed that the goats were restless, pacing in their section of the cave and bleating with unusual frequency. Bramble refused to leave the entrance, lying across the threshold with his ears flat against his skull, whining softly at sounds only he could hear. "Something's wrong," Callum said, watching the animals with worried eyes. "They're scared." "I know." Elspeth looked up at the sky, trying to read its intentions. The clouds were thick and low, a uniform gray that seemed to press down on the mountains like a weight. There was no wind yet, but the air had a strange quality to it, a heaviness that made her skin prickle. Ezra had stopped by that morning, his face grim. "It's coming," he had said, not bothering to specify what. "Tonight, maybe tomorrow. Don't go outside once it starts, not for anything." By evening, the gentle snowfall had intensified. The flakes were larger now, falling faster, and a wind had begun to whisper through the canyon, carrying the snow sideways in swirling gusts. The temperature, which had been merely cold, began to plummet. Elspeth made her final preparations. She checked and double-checked the fodder supply. She milked the goats and stored the milk in clay pots near the back of the entrance chamber, where it would stay cool but not freeze. She reinforced the goatskin covering over the entrance, weighing it down with heavy stones. Then she retreated to the second chamber with Callum and Bramble, pulling the hide curtain closed behind them, sealing themselves into the darkness of the earth. The blizzard hit at full force around midnight. The sound was unlike anything Elspeth had ever heard. It was not the howl of a normal windstorm. It was a roar A shriek, a chorus of demons screaming their fury at the world. The wind slammed against the canyon walls with physical force, and even deep inside the cave, she could feel the vibration of it, the sheer rage of nature unleashed. She lit a single candle and held Callum close. The boy was trembling, not from cold, for the cave remained remarkably warm, but from fear. Bramble pressed against them both, his warm bulk a comfort in the darkness. "It's all right," she whispered, though her own heart was racing. "The cave will protect us. That's what it's for." "Are we going to die?" Callum's voice was small, childlike in a way it had not been for months. "No." She squeezed him tighter. "We are not going to die. Father prepared this place for us. The earth will keep us safe." The storm raged on. In the valley below, chaos reigned. The blizzard had caught Stone Creek by surprise. Despite the warnings of the old-timers, most people had convinced themselves that it would be a mild winter, that the signs were merely coincidence. They had not prepared. They had not stocked enough firewood or fodder. They had not reinforced their barns or insulated their houses. Now they were paying the price. At the Henderson farm, the wind tore a section of roof off the barn, exposing the cattle inside to the killing cold. By morning, 7 animals would be dead, frozen where they stood. At the Tanner house, a window blew in during the night, filling the kitchen with snow faster than it could be cleared. The family huddled in the back bedroom, burning furniture to keep warm. At Dr. Marsh's fine home in the center of town, the expensive cast-iron stove proved unequal to the task. The doctor and his wife sat wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching their breath frost in the air, wondering if they would see morning. And at the Whitmore Ranch, disaster struck. The great barn that Silas had built with such pride, the barn that represented his status and his success, was not designed for a storm of this magnitude. The wind found every crack and gap, driving snow through walls that should have been solid, dropping the temperature inside to a level that no animal could survive. By the second morning of the storm, 15 of Silas's 30 cattle were dead. The rest were barely alive, too weak to stand, their breath coming in shallow gasps. The ranch hands who tried to reach them found themselves lost in the whiteout within yards of the barn door, saved only by the ropes they had thought to tie around their waists. Prudence wept. Silas raged, and Thaddeus thought of his cousin in her cave and wondered if she was faring any better. Inside the underground sanctuary, time had lost its meaning. Elspeth had no way of knowing how long the storm had been raging. Hours, days. The howling wind was a constant presence, a sound so unrelenting that she had almost stopped hearing it. The candles had long since burned down to stubs, and she was rationing them carefully, lighting them only when absolutely necessary. But the cave remained warm. Not comfortable, perhaps. Not the warmth of a proper house with a roaring fire, but a constant, steady temperature that felt almost miraculous compared to the killing cold she knew was ravaging the world outside. The goats lay peacefully in their bedding, chewing their cud with placid contentment. The milk she had stored had not frozen. The water in her clay jugs remained liquid. Her father had been right. The earth was keeping them alive. She fell into a routine. Wake, milk the goats, feed the goats, eat a small meal of dried meat and hardtack, check the entrance to make sure the wind had not torn away the protective covering, sleep, repeat. Callum had stopped being afraid. The initial terror had faded, replaced by a kind of wonder at their situation. He spent hours talking to the goats, giving them elaborate names and personalities, telling them stories that he made up on the spot. Bramble followed him everywhere, the old dog's patience seemingly inexhaustible. "Ellie?" Callum asked on what might have been the 3rd day, or the 4th or the 5th. "What's it like outside?" "Cold," she said, "very cold." "Colder than in here?" She thought about how to explain it. "In here, it's maybe 50 degrees. Cold enough that we need blankets, but warm enough that we won't freeze. Out there, right now, it's probably 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Cold enough that your spit would freeze before it hit the ground. Cold enough that bare skin would freeze solid in minutes." His eyes went wide. "How do you know?" "Father told me. He experienced it once, in the mines. A shaft collapsed and trapped him underground for 3 days during a winter storm. He said it was the only reason he survived. The earth kept him warm, while everyone above ground was freezing. Is that why he found this cave? Because he knew? Yes. She smiled, feeling her father's presence around her like a warm embrace. He knew, and he wanted us to know too. The storm broke on the morning of the sixth day. Elspeth woke to an unfamiliar sound, or rather, an unfamiliar absence of sound. The constant roar of the wind had stopped. The world outside had gone silent. She pushed aside the hide curtain and made her way to the entrance of the cave. The goatskin covering was still intact, weighted down with its stones, but a rim of ice had formed around its edges where the cold had tried to force its way in. She took a deep breath and pulled it aside. The sunlight was blinding. After days in the dim interior of the cave, the brilliance of sun on snow was almost painful. She shaded her eyes with her hand and looked out at a world transformed. The canyon was buried. Snow had drifted against the walls, filling the lower areas to depths of 6 or 8 feet. The spring was invisible, buried under a smooth white blanket. The path she had worn between the cave and the water source had vanished entirely. But above the drifts, the sky was a deep, crystalline blue, the kind of blue that only appears after a great storm has scoured the atmosphere clean. The sun hung low on the horizon, pale and cold but intensely bright, casting long shadows across the pristine white surface. She was alive. They were all alive. Elspeth sank to her knees in the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, and laughed until she wept. The first visitor came on the 8th day. Elspeth was outside the cave, digging a path to the spring, when she heard the sound of someone struggling through the deep snow. She straightened, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt, and watched as a figure emerged from the canyon entrance. It was Thaddeus Whitmore. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt and pale, with patches of frostbite on his cheeks and nose. His clothing was torn and inadequate, clearly not intended for the brutal conditions he had traversed. He was limping badly, favoring his left leg, and every step seemed to cost him enormous effort. Elspeth! His voice was a croak, barely recognizable. Thank God, thank God! She rushed to him, catching him as he stumbled and nearly fell. He was shaking uncontrollably, his body trying desperately to generate warmth it did not have. Inside, she said. Now! She half carried him into the entrance chamber, wrapping him in every blanket she could find, pressing a cup of warm milk into his trembling hands. Callum fed the fire while Bramble lay across Thad's feet, adding his body heat to the effort. It was nearly an hour before Thad could speak coherently. It's bad, he said, his eyes haunted. You can't imagine how bad. Tell me. The story came out in fragments, interrupted by bouts of shivering and the occasional sob that Thad seemed powerless to control. The cattle dead, the barn destroyed, his mother in hysterics and his father in a rage that had no outlet. The townspeople huddled in their inadequate houses, burning furniture to stay alive, watching helplessly as the world they had built crumbled around them. But the worst, he said, his voice breaking, the worst is Emmeline. Elspeth felt her blood turn cold. Your daughter? She's sick, fever. She needs milk, fresh milk, to keep her strength up. But all our cows are dead. Every cow in the valley is dead. There's no fresh milk anywhere. He looked at her with desperate eyes. You're the only one left. Your goats. They're the only animals that survived. Elspeth did not hesitate. She went to the back of the cave, where Hope and Mercy were resting in their comfortable beds of hay, and milked them both dry. She filled her largest container and wrapped it carefully in cloth to keep it from freezing on the journey back. Here. She pressed it into Thad's hands. Boil it before you give it to her. And there's more where this came from. I'll have fresh milk every day if you need it. Thad stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. You're just giving it to me? Your daughter is innocent. She didn't laugh at me or bet on my death. She's a child who needs help. Elspeth met his eyes. Take the milk and go. Your family needs you. He stood, still unsteady on his feet, clutching the precious container to his chest. At the entrance to the cave, he turned back. I was wrong about you, he said. We were all wrong. I'm sorry, Elspeth. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, Elspeth said. Just take care of your daughter. On the 5th day after the storm broke, when the winds had finally begun to ease, Thad returned. This time, he was not alone. He carried Emmeline in his arms, the 3-year-old bundled in every blanket the family owned. His wife Sarah followed close behind, her face gaunt with exhaustion and fear. "The house is too cold," Thad said, his voice breaking. "We've burned all the furniture. The walls are cracking from the ice. We can't keep her warm enough, Elspeth. She's getting worse." Elspeth did not hesitate. "Bring her inside. All of you. There's room." By the end of that day, 11 people had taken shelter in the underground sanctuary. Dr. Marsh and his wife, who had finally admitted that their fine house was a death trap. Harlan Tanner, his face marked by frostbite, his pride completely shattered. 2 families from the edge of town whose cabins had collapsed under the weight of the snow. And Thad's little family, with Emmeline finally sleeping peacefully in the warmth, Bramble curled protectively at her feet. The transformation was almost beyond belief. In the entrance chamber, where Elspeth had built her milking stand and organized her supplies, refugees huddled together, sharing body heat in the warmth that radiated from the stone walls. In the larger chamber beyond, the goats continued their placid routine, seemingly unbothered by the sudden increase in their human company. And through it all, Elspeth moved with calm efficiency, directing, organizing, making sure everyone had what they needed. She had become, without intending it, the leader of this unlikely community, the one person whose preparation and foresight had created a refuge in the midst of disaster. Dr. Marsh watched her with something approaching awe. "I was a fool," he said to no one in particular, "a credentialed fool. All my education, all my training, and I never once considered that the earth itself could be a source of warmth." He shook his head slowly. "Her father understood something that all my books never taught me. The old ways," Ingrid Lindqvist said. The elderly Swedish woman had made her way to the canyon on the 3rd day, guided by instinct and memory. People forget, but the earth remembers. The storm returned briefly on the 7th day, another blast of wind and snow that would have been catastrophic for anyone caught in the open. But inside the cave, the refugees barely noticed. They were warm, they were fed, they were alive. And slowly, something began to change. The barriers that had divided them, the judgments and assumptions and petty grievances of small-town life, began to dissolve in the shared experience of survival. Dr. Marsh found himself learning from Elspeth about the principles of earth-sheltered construction. Harlan Tanner, his earlier mockery forgotten, worked alongside Callum to care for the goats. Even Reverend Blackwood, who had arrived on the 4th day, looking like a man who had seen his own mortality, found himself offering prayers of genuine gratitude rather than sermons of condemnation. "I called this place pagan," he admitted one evening, his voice soft with shame. "I said it was primitive and unchristian. But God's wisdom takes many forms, doesn't it? The cave he carved into this hillside saved our lives. Who am I to question his methods?" Elspeth said nothing. She had learned that silence could be more powerful than words. "I need to pause here and ask you to think about something. We've all known people like Dr. Marsh and Reverend Blackwood, haven't we? People who are so certain they're right that they can't see what's right in front of them. People who mistake credentials for wisdom and convention for truth. Have you ever been judged by someone like that? Have you ever had to stand your ground against people who thought they knew better than you about your own life? And have you ever had the satisfaction of seeing those same people realize they were wrong? Keep that feeling in mind, because the most important moment is still ahead." The storm finally released its grip on the valley on December 29th. 6 days of blizzard, 23 people dead across 3 counties, hundreds of cattle and horses frozen where they stood. It was the worst winter disaster in Montana's recorded history, and it would be remembered for generations. But in the canyon at Broken Ridge, everyone who had taken shelter in the underground sanctuary walked out alive. Elspeth stood at the entrance of the cave and watched as her unlikely guests prepared to leave. The sky was clear, the sun almost painfully bright on the endless white expanse. The temperature was still well below 0, but after days of howling wind and killing cold, this felt almost like spring. Dr. Marsh approached her, his hat in his hands, his expression humble in a way she had never seen before. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology. I came to your cave expecting to find squalor and poor judgment. Instead, I found the most ingenious survival system I have ever encountered. He paused, struggling with words that clearly did not come easily. I was wrong. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about everything I thought I knew. Your father was a scientist in the truest sense of the word. He observed, he learned, and he passed his knowledge to you. That knowledge saved my life, and my wife's life, and the lives of everyone in this cave. Elspeth nodded slowly. Thank you, Doctor. No, he shook his head. Thank you. And I promise you this. When we rebuild, when we recover from this disaster, I will tell everyone what I learned here. The earth itself is a source of warmth. Your father knew it. Now I know it too. Harlan Tanner was next. He approached with his head down, unable to meet her eyes. I bet $5 you would die, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I told everyone you were building your own grave. I laughed at you. I made fun of you. And you? He trailed off, unable to find the words. I survived, Elspeth finished for him. You did more than survive. He finally looked up, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. You built something that works. Something none of us were smart enough to build. And while we were laughing at you, you were saving yourself. You were saving all of us. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. Here, $5. The bet I made that you would die. I don't want your money. I know you don't. That's why I'm giving it to you. He pressed it into her hand. Buy something for your brother, or for your goats. Buy something that reminds you that sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are the ones who understand the least. Silas Whitmore arrived on the 10th day. He came alone, riding through the drifts on a horse that was barely able to make the journey. He looked older than Elspeth remembered, diminished somehow, as if the storm had stripped away something essential from him. He stopped at the edge of the canyon and dismounted, his movements slow and stiff. He was not a young man, and the disaster had aged him further. His face was haggard, his eyes sunken, his proud posture bent by exhaustion and loss. He walked the last 100 yards on foot, his boots breaking through the frozen crust with each step. Elspeth waited for him at the entrance of the cave, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Uncle, she said when he finally reached her. He did not respond immediately. His eyes moved over the cave entrance, over the neat organization of the interior, over the healthy goats visible in the firelight. He saw everything that the others had seen, the warmth, the plenty, the evidence of planning and wisdom that had saved lives while his own preparations had failed. 17 cattle, he said finally. That's how many I lost. Out of 30, more than half my herd. His voice was flat, drained of its usual authority. The barn will have to be rebuilt. The house has damage that will take months to repair. My wife has not stopped crying since the storm ended. Elspeth waited. Your milk saved my granddaughter's life. The words seemed to cost him something. Thad told me. She was dying, and your goats were the only source of fresh milk in the entire valley. If you had said no, I would never say no to a child in need. No. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than judgment in his eyes. No, I don't suppose you would. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of conflict and misunderstanding, of assumptions and accusations that now seem hollow in the face of what had happened. I came to see for myself, Silas said finally, to see this cave that kept you alive when nothing else could, to see if it was luck or if it was something else. And what do you see? He was quiet for a long moment. I see that my brother was smarter than I ever gave him credit for. I see that he taught his daughter things that I dismissed as foolishness. I see that I was wrong. He met her eyes. I will not ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I see now. I understand. He turned and walked back to his horse, his footsteps heavy in the snow. At the edge of the canyon, he paused and looked back. There will be no more talk of taking your land, he said. It is yours. It will always be yours. You have earned it. Then he was gone, swallowed by the white landscape, leaving Elspeth alone with her goats and her brother, and the profound satisfaction of vindication. Spring came late that year, as if the earth itself needed time to recover from the brutality of the winter. When the snow finally began to melt, revealing the scarred and battered landscape beneath, the true toll of the blizzard became clear. The economy of the region had been set back by years. Families who had thought themselves secure were now facing ruin. But in the small canyon in the Broken Ridge country, life went on. Elspeth's goats had not only survived, they had thrived. Both Hope and Mercy had given birth during the storm, each delivering healthy twins. Where there had been 2 goats, there were now 6, with the promise of more to come. And word of the underground sanctuary had spread. The first to come seeking knowledge was Thaddeus. He arrived in early April with a notebook and a pencil, ready to learn. "Show me," he said simply. "Show me how you did it." Elspeth showed him everything. The principles of earth temperature stability, the design of the drainage channels, the importance of the ventilation fissures, the way the rock walls absorbed heat during warm periods and released it during cold ones. She held nothing back, sharing freely the knowledge that her father had given her. Thad took careful notes, asked intelligent questions, and went home to begin digging his own earth shelter. By summer's end, he had created a modest underground barn that kept his surviving cattle comfortable through the hottest days of August. Others followed. Farmers who had laughed at the crazy Whitmore girl now came to her canyon with their hats in their hands, asking politely if she might have time to explain her methods. She welcomed them all, teaching without judgment, sharing without resentment. The Whitmore method, people began to call it. Within 3 years, there were a dozen earth-sheltered structures in the valley, ranging from simple root cellars to elaborate underground barns. The technique had saved countless animals during the harsh winters that followed, and more than a few human lives as well. The discovery came in the spring of 1889, more than a year after the Great Blizzard. Callum was cleaning out the deepest corner of the second chamber, a task he had been putting off for months. The area had accumulated debris during the winter, a jumble of old bedding and broken tools and odds and ends that had been shoved aside in the chaos of survival. His rake struck something hard. At first he thought it was just another rock, but when he bent down to move it, he found that it was not a rock at all. It was a metal box, rusted with age, wedged into a crevice in the limestone wall. "Ellie!" His voice echoed through the cave. "Ellie, come here!" She came running, her heart pounding with sudden fear. But the look on Callum's face was not fear, it was wonder. "Look," he said, holding out the box. "I found it in the wall, hidden." The lock had long since rusted shut. Elspeth used her knife to pry it open, her hands trembling with anticipation. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but still legible. And on the first page, in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere, were the words, "For my children, when they are ready. Your father, Ewan James Whitmore." She sat down on the cold stone floor, the journal cradled in her lap, and began to read. The entries spanned nearly a decade. Her father had discovered the cave in 1878, 9 years before his death, and had been preparing it ever since. There were detailed measurements of temperature, recorded faithfully through 6 winters. There were drawings of the chamber layout, with notes about drainage and ventilation. There were calculations about food storage and water supply, about how many animals the space could support, about what would be needed to survive a prolonged siege of cold. He had known. He had always known. And he had spent years preparing this sanctuary for the children he loved, against the day when they might need it. "He never told us," Callum whispered, tears streaming down his face. "All those years and he never said a word. He was waiting for the right time." Elspeth's voice was thick with emotion. "Waiting until we were old enough to understand. He ran out of time." She turned to the last entry, dated just 3 weeks before the diphtheria came. "The cave is ready. The knowledge is in their heads, even if they don't know it yet. Elspeth has her mother's strength and her grandmother's wisdom. Callum has a gentleness that will serve him well. If the worst should happen, if I am taken before I can teach them everything, they will find their way. I have faith in them. And if you are reading this, my dear ones, know that I never left you. I am in these walls. I am in this earth. I am in every breath of warm air that keeps you alive when the world outside is trying to kill you. Trust the earth. It will not fail you." Your loving father, Elspeth, closed the journal and held it to her chest, feeling her father's presence around her like a warm embrace. He had not abandoned them. He had been with them all along, guiding them, protecting them, even from beyond the grave. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for everything." Ezra Boone became a permanent fixture in Elspeth's life. He built a small cabin at the mouth of the canyon, close enough to help when needed, far enough to preserve the solitude he still craved. He taught Callum everything he knew about hunting and trapping and surviving in the wilderness, and the boy absorbed it all with the eagerness of a plant turning toward the sun. Ingrid Lindqvist passed away in the spring of 1890, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. In her will, she left Elspeth a small chest containing seeds from the old country, recipes for traditional Swedish cheeses, and a letter that Elspeth kept for the rest of her life. "You reminded me," the letter said, "of what my grandmother always taught, that the old ways survive because they work, that wisdom is not always written in books, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust what you know, even when everyone tells you that you are wrong. Thank you, dear girl, for reminding an old woman what courage looks like." In the summer of 1893, Thaddeus Whitmore asked Elspeth to marry him. It was not a romantic proposal. Romance had never been their way. It was a practical acknowledgement of what had grown between them over 6 years of working side by side, rebuilding their relationship from the ruins of their family's conflict. "I know I was not your friend when you needed one," he said. "I know I stayed silent when I should have spoken. But I have tried to be better. I have tried to learn from you and to help where I could. And I have come to care for you in a way I never expected." Elspeth looked at this man who had once been a stranger, then an adversary, then a student, and finally somehow a friend. She thought about all the years that stretched ahead, all the winters that would test them, all the challenges they would face. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They would in the little church in Stone Creek, with Reverend Blackwood officiating and most of the town in attendance. Silas and Prudence sat in the front pew, their faces carefully neutral, their opposition long since worn away by time and circumstance. Callum stood beside his sister as her witness, no longer the frightened boy who had followed her into the wilderness, but a young man of 18 with steady hands and clear eyes. Bramble, too old and stiff to make the journey to town, waited for them at the cave. When they returned that evening, he greeted them with a slow wag of his tail and a contented sigh, as if to say that everything had worked out exactly as it should. The old dog died that winter, peacefully in his sleep, curled up in his favorite spot at the entrance to the second chamber. Elspeth and Callum buried him just outside the cave, beneath a flat stone that Callum carved with simple words. "Bramble, a faithful friend, 1880 to 1893. Elspeth visited his grave every day for the rest of her life. The years passed, as years do, carrying with them their burden of joy and sorrow. Elspeth and Thad had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, all raised with the knowledge of the earth that their mother and grandfather had possessed. The oldest girl, Moira, named for Elspeth's mother, showed a particular aptitude for the work, and by the time she was 12, she could explain the principles of earth-sheltered construction as well as any engineer. Callum never married. He built his own cabin near the mouth of the canyon and lived there for the rest of his life, tending the goats that had grown into a substantial herd, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. He became known throughout Montana as the man to see if you wanted to build something that would last, something that would keep you safe when the worst came. Ezra Boone lived to the remarkable age of 91, defying all expectations for a man who had spent so many years in the wilderness. He died in the summer of 1910, sitting in a chair outside his cabin, looking out at the mountains he had called home for half a century. Elspeth was with him at the end, holding his weathered hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped. "Thank you," she whispered to him, though she knew he could no longer hear. "Thank you for finding us. Thank you for staying." In 1978, a team of researchers from Montana State University came to the Whitmore Canyon. They had heard stories about an old cave, built up a century ago by a teenage girl and her brother, that had somehow survived when everything around it failed. They were skeptical, as academics often are, expecting to find nothing more than the usual exaggerations of local folklore. What they found instead was a revelation. The cave system was intact, almost exactly as Elspeth had designed it. The stone partitions still stood. The drainage channels still functioned. The ventilation fissures still drew fresh air through the space, and when they placed temperature sensors throughout the interior, They recorded readings that confirmed everything the old stories had claimed. 53 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, regardless of conditions outside. It's the same principle as modern passive house design, the lead researcher said in his subsequent paper. The thermal mass of the surrounding Earth, combined with the natural ventilation, creates a stable microclimate that requires almost no additional heating or cooling. What's remarkable is that this was accomplished in 1887 by an 18-year-old girl with no formal education, using nothing more than hand tools and inherited knowledge. The cave was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1985, designated as a significant example of vernacular architecture and indigenous building techniques. A small plaque was installed at the entrance, telling the story of Elspeth Whitmore and her underground sanctuary. But the greatest monument to Elspeth's legacy was not made of stone or bronze. It was made of the lives that her knowledge had saved, the families that had survived because of techniques she had taught, the community that had been transformed by her quiet example. Elspeth Whitmore Garrett died in the spring of 1942, at the age of 73. She passed peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the house that Thad had built for her near the mouth of the canyon where it all began. Her last words, spoken to her eldest granddaughter, were simple and characteristic. "Trust the earth," she said. "It knows more than we do." She was buried beside Bramble, beneath the flat stone that Callum had carved so many years ago. The inscription on her own stone, chosen by her children, read, Elspeth Moira Whitmore Garrett, 1869 to 1942. She listened to the earth, and the earth answered. And so the question remains, waiting to be asked of you. What is the worthless ground in your own life? What talent, what knowledge, what instinct have you been told is foolish or impractical or embarrassing? What cave are you afraid to enter? What hole are you afraid to dig? Because everyone around you says it cannot be done. The conventional wisdom of the crowd is loud and confident. It speaks with the voice of experience and the weight of tradition. It tells you what is possible and what is not, what is proper and what is not, what a person like you should and should not attempt. But perhaps there is another voice, quieter and older, speaking from somewhere deep inside. Perhaps it is the voice of a grandmother who knew the old ways. Perhaps it is the voice of a father who understood things that others had forgotten. Perhaps it is simply the voice of your own heart, telling you that there is another path, if only you have the courage to take it. Elspeth Whitmore was 18 years old when she walked away from everything she had known, following a dead man's map to a hole in the ground. Everyone told her she was wrong. Everyone told her she would fail. Everyone told her that the only wise course was to surrender, to accept the judgment of those who knew better, to take the charity that was offered and be grateful. She said no. She picked up her father's spade and she began to dig. And when the winter came, when the storm raged and the cold killed, and the skeptics froze in their fine houses, she sat in her cave with her goats and her brother and her faithful dog. And she milked and she waited and she survived. They laughed at the widow's children in their underground goat pen. They laughed until the blizzard came, and then they came crawling through the snow, begging for the warmth and the milk and the salvation that only she could provide. Perhaps it is time to pick up your own spade. Perhaps it is time to start digging. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if it made you think about your own life and the challenges you face, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. We all know someone who is being told they cannot succeed, who is being laughed at for daring to try something different. Maybe this story will give them the courage to keep going. And remember, sometimes the most important work we do is the work that no one else understands. Sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the earth itself is waiting to teach us, if only we are humble enough to listen. Until next time, keep faith in yourself, keep digging, and never let anyone tell you that your dreams are just holes in the ground. The end.